The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet street as the sound of a police siren sliced through the evening air. It was a routine patrol, or at least it seemed that way at first. Officer Daniels cruised down the street, eyes scanning the sidewalk, keeping his distance from the usual chaos. But then something caught his eye. A young man standing by the curb, seemingly just waiting to be noticed. The officer's grip tightened on the steering wheel as his instincts kicked in. This wasn't just any young man. This was Derek Stevens, the son of Police Captain Stevens, one of the highest-ranking officers in the precinct. Officer Daniels' mind raced as he parked his cruiser. The last time he'd seen Derek had been years ago, back when he was just a teenager. But now, Derek was a grown man, out on his own, with his life ahead of him. Still, Officer Daniels couldn't shake the anger that had been bubbling inside him for so long. He'd watched Captain Stevens rise through the ranks, admired the man's dedication to the force, but there was a deep resentment that he couldn't ignore. As Daniels stepped out of the car, he couldn't help but notice the coldness in Derek's eyes. The young man seemed to know exactly what was coming. His posture was stiff, as though he was already bracing for the inevitable. "What's going on here, Derek?" Officer Daniels asked, his voice rough, trying to keep the suspicion from seeping in. Derek's eyes flashed with confusion, but he didn't answer right away. He knew what Daniels was thinking, and there was no hiding the truth. Derek had spent years working hard to keep his head down, to stay out of trouble, but life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it. He wasn't expecting this. Not like this. His father's legacy had always loomed over him, and in many ways, it had made him feel like he had something to prove, not just to the world, but to his father as well. He couldn't afford to mess up, not when so many were watching, waiting for him to fail. But what Officer Daniels didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was the series of events that would unfold next. Derek's calm, collected demeanor faltered slightly, but he stood tall, even as Daniels' hands began to move toward his cuffs. The officer was already making his move, not even giving Derek a chance to explain. And that's when the first snap of tension hit the air. A mistake, a gut reaction driven by something deeper than just the law. Daniels wasn't thinking about the young man standing in front of him. He wasn't thinking about Derek's father. He was thinking about something that had been eating at him for years: resentment, frustration, and bitterness. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked into place, it felt like the world had slowed down. Derek tried to protest, but the words didn't come out right. "Wait, you're making a mistake," he managed, his voice trembling with both confusion and fear. But the officer didn't respond. There was no turning back now. As Daniels led him toward the cruiser, Derek's heart raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief. His mind flashed back to all the conversations he'd had with his father about justice, fairness, and the weight of being the son of a man who had spent his life fighting to make the system better. But now, here he was, being arrested by someone he once considered an ally. As Daniel shoved Derek into the back of the car, the young man's eyes locked onto the officer's, searching for any sign of recognition, any sign that the man before him was the same one who had once praised his father's work. But there was nothing. Only a cold, hardened look that said everything Derek needed to know. This wasn't just about the law anymore. This was something personal. In the silence of the police car, Derek felt his world crashing down. How had it come to this? Was his father's reputation enough to save him, or was he about to pay the price for someone else's bitterness? He had no idea. All he knew was that this was far from over. What he didn't realize yet was that his father was on his way, and when Captain Stevens arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. The tension that hung in the air wasn't just about an arrest anymore. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. The years of resentment, the mistakes, and the unforgivable missteps that had made this situation so much more than it appeared. As the car sped off into the night, Derek's mind raced, filled with 1,000 questions. But one thing was certain. This was the moment when everything changed. And as the sirens faded into the distance, the true story of what had happened would unfold, piece by piece, in ways that no one could have expected. Derek sat in the back of the police car, his mind spinning in a storm of confusion and disbelief. He stared out of the small barred window, watching the streetlights blur into streaks of orange as the car sped through the city. The rhythmic hum of the engine did little to calm his racing thoughts. This wasn't how his life was supposed to go. He had spent years working hard to earn his place in the world, trying to live up to the expectations of a father who had become a symbol of integrity and justice. But now, in the back of a squad car, the weight of his family's name felt like a curse more than a blessing. Growing up, Derek had always admired his father from a distance. Captain Stevens was a man of principle, someone who had built a career on fighting for what was right. But Derek had never fully understood the pressure his father faced. He had seen the long hours, the constant battles with the system, the never-ending struggles to maintain honor in a world that seemed to be crumbling around him. As a boy, Derek had thought he was invincible, that he could escape the shadows of his father's work and forge his own path. But now, in this moment, it felt like he was trapped in those very same shadows. He glanced over at Officer Daniels, who was gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw set in a firm line. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, almost suffocating. Derek could feel the officer's anger, the bitterness that had been brewing for years. It was in every muscle of Daniels' stiff posture, every cold glance he threw Derek's way in the rearview mirror. It wasn't just the arrest that bothered Daniels, it was who Derek was, who his father was. For some reason, Daniels seemed to resent everything Derek stood for, even though Derek hadn't done anything wrong. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was personal. Derek tried to remember the last time he had spoken to Officer Daniels. He had always seen him as just another cop on the force, nothing more than a colleague of his father's. But now, in the back of this car, Derek could see the cracks in the officer's carefully constructed exterior. He could feel the weight of the years that had passed, the mistakes Daniels had made, and the growing disillusionment that had festered beneath his badge. It was clear to Derek now, this arrest wasn't just about him. It was about something much deeper, something that neither he nor Daniels could avoid any longer. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden screech of tires as the car took a sharp turn, heading deeper into the heart of the city. Derek's stomach lurched as he realized that they were heading toward the precinct. His heart raced. His father was there. Captain Stevens was known for his unwavering commitment to justice, but he wasn't above using his position to protect his family. Derek knew that his father wouldn't stand by and let him be humiliated like this, not without a fight. But even as that thought crossed his mind, another, darker thought followed. What if his father couldn't stop this? What if the system that Captain Stevens had worked so hard to fix had finally come for him too? Officer Daniels glanced in the rearview mirror again, catching Derek's eyes. There was something unsettling in the officer's gaze, a coldness that made Derek's skin crawl. It was the kind of look that made you wonder if the man had any humanity left at all. Daniels didn't speak, but the tension between them was undeniable. Derek could almost feel the weight of Daniels' anger pressing against him, like a heavy hand on his chest. He wasn't just being arrested. He was being punished. Minutes later, they arrived at the precinct. The flashing lights of the police cars outside the building cast long shadows across the pavement, and Derek couldn't help but feel a knot form in his stomach. His father was inside. He could already see Captain Stevens' face in his mind. His strong, resolute expression, the way he always managed to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a simple case of someone needing his help. This was his son, his blood, being treated like a criminal. How would his father react? Would he be angry, disappointed, or would he fight, as he always did, to make sure Derek was treated fairly? As the car came to a stop, Officer Daniels got out without a word, leaving Derek alone in the backseat. The doors were locked, and the silence inside the car was deafening. Derek pressed his forehead against the cold window, staring at the building ahead of him. He could already hear the muffled voices from inside, the footsteps of officers moving quickly, preparing for what was to come. His mind raced. This wasn't just about the police captain's son being arrested. This was about power, control, and the bitter resentment of a man who had allowed his own demons to cloud his judgment. Derek knew that this moment would change everything. Whether it was for better or worse, he couldn't say. Inside the building, Captain Stevens was on the phone, discussing an ongoing case with one of his colleagues. His mind, usually sharp and focused, was elsewhere. The phone call wasn't important. His son was. He had received a call minutes ago informing him of Derek's arrest, and nothing could prepare him for the wave of anger and confusion that had rushed over him. He didn't care what the charges were. He didn't care about the details. All that mattered was that his son was being treated like a criminal, and he wasn't going to let it stand. As Captain Stevens ended the call, he stormed out of his office, his eyes scanning the precinct for any sign of his son. He didn't have to look far. Officer Daniels was coming through the door, his face hard as stone. The officer didn't make eye contact, but Captain Stevens could sense the weight of the situation before Daniels even spoke. "He's in the holding cell," Daniels muttered, his voice colder than usual. Captain Stevens didn't waste a second. Without a word, he turned on his heel and headed toward the holding area. His mind was already spinning with possibilities, strategies, negotiations, and confrontations. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let anyone get away with this. Not when it came to his son. As Captain Stevens walked down the sterile hallway of the precinct, the sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, filling the silence with an unsettling finality. His heart raced, not with fear, but with a kind of restrained fury that only a father could understand. The deeper he walked into the building, the more he felt the weight of the badge he wore, the legacy he had built, and the long years of work that had defined his life. It had always been about justice, fairness, and doing the right thing. But as he neared the holding cells, something inside him shifted. He wasn't walking toward a case. He was walking toward his son. He reached the holding area and paused, steadying himself for what was to come. Derek's arrest was no mere procedural issue. It was a betrayal, an insult. It wasn't just that his son was being treated unfairly. It was the fact that the arrest was personal. Officer Daniels had crossed a line, and Captain Stevens could feel it in his bones. This wasn't the first time he had witnessed the consequences of a broken system, but it had never felt this close, this intimate. The door to the holding cell was open, and there stood Derek, his hands still cuffed, his face a mixture of confusion and quiet disbelief. The young man was slumped against the wall, staring down at the floor as if the weight of the world had descended upon him. When he looked up and saw his father standing in the doorway, his eyes widened, but he didn't say a word. It was as if the room itself had been holding its breath. And now that his father was here, the air seemed to thicken with expectation. There was a moment of silence between them, a charged stillness, as the years of Derek's upbringing, his father's sacrifices, and the values they had shared hung in the balance. Captain Stevens stepped forward, his gaze never leaving his son. "Derek," he said quietly, his voice betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. "What happened?" Derek opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to falter in his throat. The weight of the situation seemed to paralyze him, but he finally managed to speak. "Dad, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't understand why he arrested me." Captain Stevens could see the raw fear in his son's eyes, but there was something else there too, something deeper, a quiet understanding that this wasn't just about an arrest. This was about everything that had led up to this moment, all the years of unspoken tension between the officer and the Stevens family, all the unresolved issues that had been simmering beneath the surface. Captain Stevens sighed, running a hand through his hair, the frustration building up inside him. He turned to the officer who had just entered the room behind him, Officer Daniels. The officer stood a few feet away, his arms crossed and his jaw clenched tight. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of both history and the present. Daniels avoided eye contact, and Captain Stevens could see the flicker of something dark in the officer's expression. It wasn't guilt. It was something far more dangerous, a bitterness that had festered over the years, eating away at him, until it had found its target in Derek. Captain Stevens stepped closer, his voice now hard, edged with the authority he had carried for years. "What's going on, Daniels? Why was my son arrested?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak at first. Captain Stevens wasn't surprised. He had known Daniels long enough to recognize the signs of a man who was hiding something. Finally, Daniels muttered. He was acting suspicious. "I had to make the call." Captain Stevens narrowed his eyes. He could feel the anger rising, but he held it back. "Suspicious. Derek doesn't fit your idea of what's suspicious, Daniels. He's never been a problem. So what's the real reason?" Daniels flinched as if the words had struck him harder than intended. But he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced away, his eyes flickering toward the door, as if looking for an escape. But there was no easy way out of this. Not anymore. Captain Stevens took another step forward, his voice low but firm. "You know what this is about. This isn't just an arrest. This is personal. I can see it in your eyes." He paused, waiting for a response that would never come. "You've been carrying something around for a long time, haven't you, Daniels? And now you're taking it out on my son." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything felt suspended. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flashing with something Captain Stevens couldn't quite place. It wasn't just resentment anymore. It was something darker, something that went deeper than any professional disagreement. Finally, Daniels spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to do this. But your son, he's just like you, always playing by the rules, always thinking the system can fix itself. It's all a damn lie." Captain Stevens stared at him, the realization hitting like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just about the law. Daniels wasn't angry with Derek. He was angry with the very idea of justice, of everything Captain Stevens had spent his life fighting for. Daniels had tried, and failed, to uphold the very ideals that Captain Stevens had built his career on. And now, in a moment of twisted retaliation, he had used Derek as a pawn. There was a long silence before Captain Stevens spoke again, his voice colder than it had ever been. "You think tearing my son down is going to fix your problems, Daniels. You think hurting him will give you the peace you've been searching for." He stepped even closer to the officer, towering over him now. "You're wrong." The words stung, but it wasn't the anger in Captain Stevens' voice that affected Daniels. It was the truth, the realization that he had crossed a line, that the very system he had once vowed to serve had turned against him. And now, there would be no going back. Captain Stevens turned back to his son, the hurt in his eyes softening as he approached Derek. He unlocked the handcuffs with a single swift motion, and as the metal clinked to the floor, Derek looked up at his father, his face a mixture of relief and fear. But the fear wasn't for himself anymore. It was for the man who had once been his idol, now crumbling under the weight of his own failures. "Let's go, son," Captain Stevens said softly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Derek nodded, following his father out of the holding area. But as they walked, the heavy silence between them was not just the absence of sound. It was the beginning of something that neither of them had anticipated. A reckoning, not just with the officer who had wronged them, but with a system that had failed them both. And outside, as they walked toward the door, the world seemed different somehow. It wasn't just about the arrest anymore. It was about what came next. And as the doors of the precinct swung open, Captain Stevens knew that this was only the beginning of a much bigger battle, one that would take everything he had left to win. As they stepped outside the precinct, the cool night air hit them, and for a moment, it felt like they had left the chaos behind, though both knew better. The weight of what had just transpired was still hanging in the air between them. Derek walked silently beside his father, unsure of what to say, unsure if there was even anything to say that could make this moment feel any less strange, any less surreal. His mind was still trying to catch up, still racing with thoughts of what had just happened and why. Why had Daniels done it? Why now? Captain Stevens, though quiet, could feel the growing tension in his son. The night had taken on an oppressive quality. The streets quieter than usual, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Captain Stevens didn't know what Derek was thinking. He was still trying to process everything himself. But there was something in the silence between them that told him his son was far more affected than he was letting on. He knew his son well enough to understand the way Derek carried himself. Always calm, always composed. But tonight, Derek was different. Tonight, the weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. When they reached the car, Captain Stevens stopped and turned to face Derek, his expression softening. "Derek," he said quietly, his voice edged with the quiet resolve that had always been a part of him. "What happened back there? It wasn't just an arrest. It was a warning. For both of us. And for you, especially. I need you to understand that this isn't over." He paused, searching his son's face for any sign that Derek was truly hearing him. "It's not just about what Daniels did. It's about the world we live in. The system, the politics, everything. It's a game, Derek. And sometimes, we're all just pawns." Derek looked up at his father, his expression unreadable. "I don't understand," he said, his voice tight. "Why me? Why was I the one he picked? I didn't do anything wrong. I was just standing there." Captain Stevens exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Because you're my son," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of experience. "And Daniels wasn't just looking at you. He was looking at me. At everything I stand for. This was about something much deeper than an arrest, Derek. This was about the system he feels has failed him, the bitterness that has been eating at him for years. And in his mind, you're a symbol of everything he resents, everything I've built, everything he thinks I've taken from him." Derek stood still, digesting his father's words, but there was something deep inside him that resisted it. He didn't want to believe that this was all about resentment, that his life was somehow caught up in a web of political games he didn't understand. But as his father spoke, he realized that maybe it was true. Maybe this wasn't just about a single officer's actions. It was about everything his father had fought for, and everything that had gone wrong along the way. "I don't want to be a symbol, Dad," Derek said quietly. "I just want to live my life, to do something good, to make a difference." His voice faltered slightly. "But every time I think I have a chance to do something meaningful, something like this happens. It's like I can't escape it. I can't escape what people think of me. Because of you, because of your name, because of your work." Captain Stevens' gaze softened as he took in his son's words. He had heard the frustration in Derek's voice before, had seen the struggle in his son's eyes as he tried to navigate a world that seemed to hold him to impossible standards, just because of who his father was. Derek had always been a good kid, a smart one, and his father had raised him to believe in justice, in right and wrong, in doing what was best for the greater good. But life wasn't as simple as those ideals. Captain Stevens had learned that the hard way. And now his son was learning the same thing. "I know, Derek," he said softly. "I know it's hard. I know that it feels like you're stuck, like your life isn't yours to control. But listen to me. What Daniels did, that was his mistake. He tried to break you down because he saw something in you that made him feel weak. Don't let it consume you. You don't owe anyone an explanation for who you are. You're not me. You're your own person, and you have your own path to follow. Don't let this moment define you." Derek's eyes narrowed, the frustration still written across his face. "But it does define me, doesn't it? People are always going to look at me and see your son, and that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that I can't do anything about it. No matter what I do, I'll never be seen as just Derek. I'll always be the kid of the man who's changed everything, for better or for worse. I can't escape it. Captain Stevens stepped closer, his voice firm but full of understanding. You won't escape it, Derek, but you'll learn how to live with it, how to make it your strength, not your weakness. It's not about running from who you are. It's about standing tall in the face of it, in the face of everything that tries to drag you down. People will try to define you based on who they think you should be, but you don't have to let them. You have the power to choose your path, even when it seems impossible. For a moment, they stood there in the cold night, each of them struggling to reconcile their own version of the truth. Derek could feel the weight of his father's words, the heavy truth in them, but something in him still resisted. Could he really live up to the impossible standards that the world had set for him? Could he make a difference, even if he didn't have the freedom to define himself the way he wanted? Or was his fate already sealed? "Dad," Derek started, his voice a mixture of doubt and determination. "What happens now? What do we do about Daniels? About everything?" Captain Stevens didn't answer immediately. He glanced back at the precinct, where the flicker of lights from inside the building seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. He could feel the weight of the decision ahead of him. The system was broken, fractured beyond repair, and there were times when doing the right thing felt impossible. But he had raised Derek to be better than that, to never back down in the face of injustice, to fight even when it felt like the world was stacked against him. And now, it was time to put that teaching into action. "We'll deal with it, Derek, together. But you have to promise me one thing," Captain Stevens said, his voice low and serious. "No matter how hard it gets, no matter what happens next, you have to keep your head straight. Don't let the darkness in the world steal your light. There are too many people who need you to stay strong." Derek looked at his father, his chest tightening with a mixture of emotions. For the first time in a long while, he felt something resembling clarity, like he could finally see a path forward, even if it was unclear and uncertain. "I promise, Dad," Derek said quietly, his voice firm. "I'll keep going." And as they got into the car and drove away from the precinct, neither of them knew exactly what the future held. But one thing was certain: the battle had only just begun. And together, they would face whatever came next. The next few days passed in a blur of frustration, paperwork, and tense phone calls. Captain Stevens tried his best to maintain his composure, handling the aftermath of the arrest with the stoic resolve that had earned him his position in the first place. But each passing moment felt heavier, like a weight pressing down on his shoulders, reminding him of how fragile the line between justice and corruption really was. The system he had spent his life working to fix had just failed him. And it wasn't just a small slip. It was a seismic shift that threatened to unravel everything he had fought for. Derek, on the other hand, spent most of the days locked in his thoughts. He stayed in his room more often than not, his mind a whirlwind of doubt, anger, and confusion. His father's words kept echoing in his head, but they didn't provide the comfort he had hoped for. "You have to stand tall. Don't let them define you." It all seemed so easy when his father said it, but for Derek, the weight of his own identity, of being the son of someone so powerful, so well-known, was suffocating. He couldn't escape it. No matter how hard he tried to make his own way, his father's shadow loomed large over him. And now it had been cast even darker by Officer Daniels' actions. It wasn't just about his name anymore. It was about who people thought he was, and who they thought he should be. One evening, as Derek sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a half-eaten meal, Captain Stevens entered the room. He had spent the day at the precinct, trying to contain the fallout from the incident, but his eyes were tired, exhausted even. There was a weary look in them that Derek had never seen before, a look that spoke of years of battling the very system he had sworn to protect. "Derek," his father said, his voice softer than usual, "we need to talk." Derek didn't look up immediately. He could feel the tension between them, but he didn't know how to bridge it. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, until finally, Derek lifted his gaze and met his father's eyes. "I know," he said quietly. I know we need to talk." Captain Stevens sat down across from him, his hands resting on the table, his posture more defeated than Derek had ever seen. "I don't know how we got here," he said, his voice carrying a heaviness that didn't belong to the usually composed man. I thought I had prepared you for this kind of world, for the kind of people who would try to tear you down just because of who you are. But I've been wrong about a lot of things, Derek." Derek's chest tightened at his father's words. The older man's vulnerability felt like a crack in the fortress of strength that Derek had always relied on. "Dad, you didn't do anything wrong. I should have been prepared for something like this," Derek said, shaking his head. "But I wasn't. I wasn't ready for someone like Daniels to do what he did. I've spent so much of my life trying to prove I'm not just some rich cop's kid, but I can't seem to get away from that. Every time something like this happens, I'm reminded that I'll always be your son first." Captain Stevens looked at him, his face softening, the lines of frustration and regret deepening around his eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Derek. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've seen a lot of things I wish I could change. But this, what happened to you, what Daniels did to you, it's not on you. It's on him. And it's on the system that lets people like him hold power, let their bitterness dictate their actions." He paused, his hands clenched now, as if he were holding back the weight of everything he had carried for so long. "You don't have to carry that burden." Derek shook his head slowly, the words sinking into him in a way they hadn't before. "But I do carry it, Dad. Every day. I don't know how to change that." His father's gaze softened, and for a moment, he seemed to look past Derek, as if seeing the entire world through a lens of experience and regret. "You change it by not letting it define you. You're not a victim, Derek. You never have been. And you don't have to be now. The system is broken, but it doesn't mean it has to break you." Derek nodded slowly, taking in his father's words, but there was still that gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. His father had lived through so much, faced so many challenges, and yet here they were, stuck in a system that felt like it was designed to grind them down. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to be who you want me to be," Derek admitted, his voice cracking under the weight of the words. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Captain Stevens leaned forward, his eyes locking with his son's. "You don't have to be anything other than who you are, Derek. You don't have to live up to anyone's expectations but your own. And that's the real fight. Figuring out who you are, regardless of all the noise, regardless of all the pressure. You've got a choice in this, son. And that's something they can't take from you." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The kitchen was quiet, save for the distant sounds of the city, the hum of life going on outside. Derek could feel the weight of his father's words, but he also knew that this wasn't an easy fix. The world wouldn't change overnight. His father's legacy wouldn't just disappear. But maybe, just maybe, he could start to see things differently. Maybe he could start seeing himself differently. That night, after dinner, Derek took a walk outside, his thoughts clearer now, though still clouded with questions. The cold air cut through him, but it wasn't the chill that made his skin prickle. It was the realization that everything had shifted. The arrest, the confrontation with Daniels, the conversations with his father. It had all forced Derek to confront who he was, who he had been, and who he might become. It wasn't just about standing tall in the face of adversity anymore. It was about standing tall in the face of his own doubts. As he walked, he passed by the precinct again, the building now just a shadow in the distance. It had been the place where his life had nearly crumbled, but now, in the quiet of the night, it felt different. It wasn't the place that defined him anymore. He would have to define himself. When he returned home, his father was still in his office, sitting by the desk, lost in thought. But when Derek entered, his father looked up and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the silent understanding between them. There were no more words to be said. Not yet. But Derek felt something shift in him, a sense of quiet determination that hadn't been there before. He didn't know what the future held, and he certainly didn't know how things would change between him and Officer Daniels. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this moment, this one mistake, shape his life forever. He could fight. He could choose who he wanted to be. And that was enough. The days that followed were both an uneasy calm and a storm waiting to break. Derek had always thought of life as something he could control, or at least manage to an extent. But the events of the past week, his arrest, his father's words, the confrontation with Officer Daniels, had shattered that illusion. It was as if the world had moved around him while he had been stuck in one moment, unsure of how to proceed, caught between the person he thought he was and the reality of the world around him. Yet there was something different about him now, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. It wasn't long before the storm did break. One evening, as Derek was returning home after a long day of trying to stay out of the spotlight, he found a letter waiting for him on the doorstep. It was an envelope, thick with paper, the kind that usually meant something serious. He picked it up, his heart racing as he wondered what it could be. He had been expecting some sort of formal apology from the department, or maybe some sort of reassignment for Officer Daniels. But when he opened it and read the contents, a different kind of shock hit him. The letter was from the police commissioner's office. It was a formal notice about the incident involving Officer Daniels and Derek's arrest. It stated that after a review of the situation, Daniels had been placed on leave pending an internal investigation. However, the letter contained something else too. An invitation. The commissioner wanted to meet with Derek and his father. The meeting wasn't about disciplinary action or further investigation. It was about Derek. It seemed that his name had become more than just the son of a police captain. It had become symbolic of something else entirely, a call for reform, for change in the way things were done, and for a deeper look into the officers who were supposed to be upholding the law. At first, Derek didn't know how to react. Part of him was stunned that his father's legacy, his own identity, had become the focal point of a much larger movement. The letter was vague about the specifics, but Derek understood its implications. This wasn't just about his arrest. This was about everything that had come before it, and everything that might come after. Captain Stevens didn't look shocked when Derek showed him the letter. Instead, he looked resigned, almost as if he had been expecting it all along. He took the letter in his hands, reading over it quietly before placing it down on the table. "They want you to speak," Captain Stevens said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "They want us both to be part of something bigger than this, bigger than what happened with Daniels." Derek stared at the letter for a long time, the words blurring before his eyes. He didn't know if he was ready for this, ready to have his name plastered on every headline, his story turned into a symbol for something he wasn't sure he understood. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back now. Whether he wanted it or not, his life had changed. His family's life had changed. And with that change came a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. "Dad, what do we do now?" Derek asked, the question sounding smaller than it should have. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his father's answer. Captain Stevens leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "We do what we've always done. We stand up for what's right. We don't back down. But this time, Derek, it's your voice. It's your turn to decide how you want to be remembered." The following week was a whirlwind. They met with the commissioner, who seemed like a man carrying the weight of the city on his shoulders. The meeting was filled with officials, lawyers, and reporters, all eager to discuss the ramifications of the arrest. Derek was nervous, standing there in front of a room full of people who wanted to use his story for their own agendas. He was tired of being a pawn in a game that had nothing to do with him. But as the commissioner spoke, as his father stood by him, Derek realized that he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't let the opportunity slip through his fingers. This wasn't just about him. This was about something far bigger, the chance to create real change, to use his voice for more than just his own benefit. The commissioner's office wanted to address the systemic issues within the department. They wanted to bring in more oversight, implement new training protocols, and most importantly, ensure that no officer ever used personal grievances to cloud their judgment. It was a start, but Derek knew it was only the beginning. These were just words on paper until action was taken. But in that room, with his father at his side and a whole new world of responsibility in front of him, Derek made a decision. He would speak. When the time came, Derek stood before the room, his father's steady presence behind him, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, could feel the history of his family's legacy bearing down on him. But this time, it wasn't about living up to anyone's expectations. This time, it was about his truth. "I didn't do anything wrong that day," Derek began, his voice shaky at first, but it quickly grew steadier as he spoke. "But it wasn't just about me. It was about the way things work. The way they've always worked. Officer Daniels didn't just arrest me because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He arrested me because I was the son of someone who tried to make a difference in a system that was broken." He paused, the words hanging in the air. "But I'm not my father, and I'm not going to let anyone use me as a tool for their own failures. This isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about the system that allowed it to happen. And that's what needs to change." For a moment, there was silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to shift, for some sign of the change they were all hoping for. And then, as if on cue, the room erupted in conversation. Reporters scribbled down notes, officials nodded in agreement, and for the first time in a long time, Derek felt like his voice had weight. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, statements, and follow-ups. Daniels was officially dismissed from the force after a thorough investigation, and though it wasn't the full resolution Derek had hoped for, it was a step in the right direction. The city began to implement reforms, small changes at first, but changes nonetheless. It wasn't a quick fix, and Derek knew that. But for the first time in his life, he saw that change was possible, even in the most broken of systems. The moment didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like an ending. But it did feel like the beginning of something that had the potential to make a real difference. And as Derek stood next to his father, watching the world unfold in front of him, he knew that this was just the start of his journey. Not as the son of a man who had spent his life fighting, but as someone who had the courage to take that fight forward, in his own way with his own voice. The world wasn't done with him yet, and he wasn't done with the world. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.